Hello, heroes. This is going to be maybe the most challenging lecture because of the nature of the content. And because of that, I'm going to have sort of a devotional or two at the end as well. And kind of a different kind of a devotional at the beginning. The 16th century was a tumultuous time. Religious and battle lines were drawn. You were either Protestant or Catholic. Anabaptists tried to be separate, but they still came under the Protestant umbrella. It was very difficult within families, communities, and nations. Gradually, things developed and changed until Vatican II, between 1962 and 1965, opened up windows and doors between Catholics and Protestants and the world. In this lecture, and perhaps with your knowledge, Poland has remained very Catholic. Do you know whom the first Polish Pope was? Cardinal Karol Wojtyla was Pope John Paul II from 1978 until 2005. Stalin, decades before, had cynically asked, "How many tanks does the Pope have?" Well, popes turned out by the millions when John Paul II visited his home country. But most significant to me was what he did every summer when he was still Archbishop and Cardinal of Krakow, Poland. Do you know what American-based group he brought in to train the priests in evangelism, discipleship, and other areas? None other than Campus Crusade for Christ, now known as Cru. That organization was started by Bill Bright after World War II, and he in turn was discipled by Henrietta Mears of First Presbyterian Church of Hollywood. So please don't see the Counter-Reformation as a still picture. See it as part of a video that one day would have a very Catholic cardinal who would one day become a pope, deploying the tanks of a very aggressive Protestant group to train priests. So here we go. As I have shared before and will share again, to every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. The Protestant Reformation was a powerful movement to which the Catholic Church felt it had to respond. In this lecture, you will learn about the purpose, organizations, individuals, councils, one in particular, and outcomes of the Counter-Reformation. Here you hear from Britannica.com of the purpose. The Counter-Reformation in the history of Christianity, the Roman Catholic involved efforts directed in the 16th and 17th centuries, both against Protestant Reformation and toward internal renewal. The Roman Catholic Church responded to the Protestant challenge by purging itself of the abuses and ambiguities that had opened the way to revolt, and then embarked upon recovery of the schismatic branches of Western Christianity with mixed success. The Counter-Reformation took place during roughly the same period as the Protestant Reformation, actually, according to some sources, beginning shortly before Martin Luther's act of nailing the 95 Theses to the door of Castle Church in 1517. Now listen to this from Wikipedia. The Counter-Reformation, or the Latin Contra Reformatio, also sometimes called the Catholic Revival, was the period of Catholic resurgence that was initiated in response to and as an alternative to the Protestant Reformations at the time. It is frequently dated to have begun with the Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, and to end with the conclusion of the European Wars of Religion in 1648, though this is controversial. The broader term Catholic Reformation, Reformatio Catholica, also encompasses reforms and movements within the church in the periods immediately before Protestantism or Trent and lasting later, close quote. And I looked up the popes of the 16th centuries, that is the 1500s, as generated and summarized by artificial intelligence, and I found the subtle differences to be interesting. First was Pope Alexander VI, who was pope from 1492 to 1503. He was known for his controversial reign and the Italian Borgia family's influence. Second came Pope Pius III in 1503, but his papacy lasted only 26 days, marking a brief and largely uneventful term. Third was Pope Julius II, who reigned as pope from 1503 to 1513. He was renowned for his patronage of the arts and commissioning Michelangelo for the Sistine Chapel as part of the Vatican, so be sure to look up that beautiful artwork. Fourth is Pope Leo X, 1513 to 1521, a Medici, that is Italian pope, which they pretty much all were, known for his lavish lifestyle and the sale of indulgences which sparked the Reformation. You remember that was part of what Martin Luther responded to. Fifth was Pope Clement VII. He was pope from 1523 to 1534. His papacy was marked by political turmoil and the sack of Rome in 1527 by mutinous troops of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, according to Wikipedia. The sixth pope of that century was Pope Paul III, who ruled from 1534 to 1549. He initiated the Counter-Reformation and convened the Council of Trent. The seventh pope was Julius III, who reigned from 1550 to 1555, who was known both for his efforts to reform the church and his patronage of the arts. Pope Paul IV ruled from 1555 through 1559. He implemented strict reforms and established the Roman Inquisition. Ninth was Pope Pius IV, who ruled from 1559 through 1565. He continued the work of the Council of Trent and sought to consolidate Catholic doctrine. I will conclude with the 10th. I won't go through the whole century, but with Pope Pius V, who ruled from 1566 through 1572. He was known for excommunicating the English or British Queen Elizabeth I, who returned the English church to being Protestant and enforcing the reforms of the Council of Trent. I'm going to look now at organizations and individuals from Britannica.com. The main group to remember is the Jesuits, who came into being during the Counter-Reformation. It was founded by Saint Ignatius of Loyola in 1534, and the main thing to remember about this group was that they swore allegiance to the Pope. Loyola was a Spanish soldier, and now I'm quoting directly from Britannica.com. The order grew out of the activity of Ignatius, a Spanish soldier, who experienced a religious conversion during a period of convalescence from a wound received in battle. After a period of intense prayer, he composed the Spiritual Exercises, a guidebook to convert the heart and mind to a closer following of Jesus Christ. On August 15, 1534, in Paris, 6 young men who had met him at the University of Paris and made a retreat according to the Spiritual Exercises joined him in vows of poverty, chastity, and a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. If this last promise did not prove possible, as it did not, they vowed to accept any apostolic work requested by the Pope. In 1539, Ignatius drafted the first outline of the order's organization, which Pope Paul III approved on September 27, 1540. The Society introduced several innovations in the form of the religious life. Among these were the discontinuance of many of the medieval practices, such as regular penances or fasts obligatory on all, a common uniform, and the choral recitation of the liturgical office, in the interest of greater mobility and adaptability. Other innovations included a highly centralized form of authority with life tenure for the head of the order, probation lasting many years before final vows, gradation of members, and lack of a female branch. That would all seem to be influenced by the influence of the military to me. That's not in the quotation, but just seems to make sense. Particular emphasis, again, this sounds like the military, was laid upon the virtue of obedience, including special obedience to the Pope. Emphasis was also placed upon flexibility, a condition that allowed Jesuits to become involved in a great variety of ministries and missionary endeavors in all parts of the world. The Society grew rapidly, and it quickly assumed a prominent role in the Counter-Reformation defense and revival of Catholicism. Almost from the beginning, education and scholarship became the Society's principal work. The early Jesuits, however, also produced preachers and catechists who devoted themselves to the care of the young, the sick, prisoners, prostitutes, and soldiers. They also were often called upon to undertake the controversial task of confessor to many of the royal and ruling families of Europe. The Society entered the foreign mission field within months of its founding, as Ignatius sent St. Francis Xavier, his most gifted companion, and 3 others to the east. More Jesuits were to be involved in missionary work than in any other activity save education. By the time of Ignatius's death in 1556, about 1,000 Jesuits were working throughout Europe and in Asia, Africa, and the New World. By 1626, the number of Jesuits was 15,544, and in 1749, the total was 22,589. Close quotes. When I look again at the history of Christianity in Asia, I will look a bit at St. Francis Xavier. When it came to their mission efforts, the Jesuits gave in to syncretism at times, combining other religions with Catholicism. They combined religions they encountered with Catholicism. The Jesuits are to be praised for standing up for minorities, but their occasional syncretistic efforts brought about controversy and even occasionally condemnation. You can see the online site that I use for the following material. Another of Rome's strongest weapons in the Counter-Reformation was the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, a religious order founded by Ignatius de Loyola in 1539, so there will be some overlap here. The order was dedicated to furthering the cause of Catholicism and propagating its teachings and missions among non-believers. In 1540, 3 of Loyola's followers, Simeon Rodriguez, who was Portuguese, Paolo Camerte, who was Italian, and Francisco Xavier, who was Spanish, arrived in Portugal. Samayo Rodriguez de Azevedo became the tutor of the king's son, and later founded the Jesuit schools at Coimbra and Évora. I'm not sure about the spelling and pronunciation of the last word. By 1555, the Jesuits had control of all secondary education in the realm, and by 1558 had established a university in Évora. I'm not sure of this name. It might be Pius III or Joachim III, invited the Jesuits to carry out their apostolic mission in the lands of Portugal's overseas empire. Francisco Xavier left Portugal in 1541 for India as a result of the king's request. He arrived in Goa in 1542 and immediately began proselytizing among the indigenous inhabitants, converting many thousands. From Goa, he went to Cochin and Ceylon, which is today Sri Lanka. In 1545, he traveled to Malacca, and in 1549 to Japan, where he stayed for 2 years. After returning to Goa in 1552, he went to China, where he died. Evangelization began in Brazil in 1549 with the arrival of 6 Jesuits led by Father Manuel de Nebrega, who accompanied Tomas de Sousa, the first Governor General. They built a church at Simón Salvador de Basilica, as well as schools at Rio de Janeiro. Here's more on Francis Xavier with some overlap. Francis Xavier, born Francisco de Jasso y Azpilicueta, I apologize for the pronunciation. The Latin would be Franciscus Xavierus. The Basque would be, you pronounce it for me, Xavier Coa, French, Francois Xavier, Spanish, Francisco Javier, Portuguese, Francisco Xavier, lived from 1506 to 1552, became a saint, was a Basque cleric. He was a Catholic missionary and made a saint who co-founded the Society of Jesus, and as a representative of the Portuguese Empire, led the first Christian mission to Japan. He was born in the town of Xavier, Kingdom of Navarre. He was a companion of Ignatius of Loyola and one of the first 7 Jesuits who took vows of poverty and chastity at Montmartre, Paris in 1534. He led an extensive mission into Asia, mainly the Portuguese Empire in the East, and was influential in evangelization work, most notably in early modern India. He was extensively involved in the missionary activity in Portuguese India. In 1546, Francis Xavier proposed the establishment of the Goan Inquisition in a letter addressed to King John III. That's who it may have been when I was trying to figure out the spelling of Portugal. While some sources claim that he actually asked for a special minister whose sole office would be to further Christianity in Goa, others disagree with this assertion. As a representative of the King of Portugal, he was also the first major Christian missionary to venture into Borneo, the Maluku Islands of Japan, and other areas. In those areas, struggling to learn the local languages and in the face of opposition, he had less success than he had enjoyed in India. Xavier was about to extend his mission to Ming China when he died on Shangchuan Island. And as you can see here, even with the best efforts, sometimes historians can disagree about various details of someone's life. He was beatified by Pope Paul V in 1619 and canonized by Pope Gregory XV in 1622. In 1624, he was made co-patron saint of Navarre, known as the Apostle of the Indies, Apostle of the Far East, Apostle of China, and Apostle of Japan. He is considered to be one of the greatest missionaries since Paul the Apostle. In 1927, Pope Pius XI published the decree Apostolicorum in Missionibus, naming Francis Xavier, along with Therese of Lisieux, co-patron of all foreign missions. He is now co-patron saint of Navarre with Fermin. The Day of Navarre in Navarre, Spain, marks the anniversary of Francis Xavier's death on December 3rd. And for more information on Francis Xavier, see pages 9 through 13 in Moffat, Volume 2, which I will share about a bit on the history of Christianity in Asia. The coming of the Jesuits 40 years after the first Portuguese landings marked a second stage in the Latinizing of the Indian Church. Well, I guess I'm sharing it now. Their first and greatest representative was the famous Francis Xavier, whose whole life contradicts the unfortunate modern stereotype of Jesuit missions as a rigid organization-centered military-style spearhead of Western colonialism. The genius of the early Jesuit missions was its spiritual bases, born in a burning personal spiritual commitment to the overwhelming reality of a God who created the world not by accident but with a purpose. It caught fire as an explosion of mission to the world for which Christ died. Before the organization came the fire and the vision. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, wrote his spiritual exercises before he wrote his constitutions, and the splendid order and organization of the latter was the child of the fire in the exercises. The first missions were spontaneous and personal. The missioner's personal vow of obedience to the Pope, formulated in 1539, was rooted in mission. Quote, I promise special obedience to the sovereign pontiff as to the missions, emphasis added by Moffat, in the manner specified in the apostolic letters and in the constitutions. Francis Xavier was a consummate example of the Jesuit ideal. Fiery missionary spontaneity linked to uncompromising organizational obedience. He reached Goa in 1542, and despite his rank as a papal nuncio or representative with special powers directly commissioned by both the Pope in Rome, and the King of Portugal, he refused the fine lodgings for him and chose to stay in a poor little cottage near the hospital. He served in India for the next 10 years, concentrating with genial, unpatronizing compassion on lepers, slaves, sinners, unbelievers, and the poorest of the poor. One observer of Xavier's first years in India said, "You would have thought he had seen Christ with his own eyes in those poor, sick persons and employed all his labor in serving him. I ask you," and that was a close quote with Moffat, but I ask you if that reminds you of another missionary. That's right, Mother Teresa, 400 years later. Moffat concludes his overall discussion of Francis Xavier and the Counter-Reformation on page 13. It is not good news. A further step in the aggravation of Indian sensibilities in the process of westernizing Christianity of the Thomas Christians, established in the first century by the Apostle Thomas, was the establishment of the Inquisition in 1560. Enforcement of the distasteful form of religious control was placed in the hands of the new and first Archbishop of Goa, who now carried a double title bishop and grand inquisitor. Even Xavier, as observed above, in accordance with his Jesuit vow of absolute obedience, had early added his profession or acceptance to the proclamation of the Inquisition as it was applied in Portugal, and had written in 1546 that it would prove useful in India. It was his understanding, however, that it would be used only against new Christians, presumably converted Muslims, Hindus, or Jews, who renounced their faith and apostatized. Nevertheless, the palace of the Inquisition in Goa represented an ever-present threat to leaders of the Thomist Christians, who might be targeted as heretics if they were tempted to stray from the orthodox Latin ways of Portuguese Christianity into their old traditional Syrian patterns. By 1572, Catholics numbered their memberships at an estimated 280,000. It might be in the millions today. Here is some more on Simão Rodrigues de Azevedo. He was born in 1510 and lived until 1579. He was also known in English as Simon Rodrigues, was a Portuguese Catholic priest and one of the co-founders of the Society of Jesus. I believe this is from Wikipedia. A Portuguese nobleman, Rodrigues was one of the 6 very first companions of Ignatius of Loyola at the University of Paris, who took vows of poverty and chastity at the chapel of Montmartre on August 15, 1534. The group of friends in the Lord will ultimately form the nucleus of the Society of Jesus, approved in 1540 in Regimini Militantes Ecclesiae, the regiment of the militant church, or the church militant. After some years working under the direction of Ignatius in Italy, he was sent to Portugal, where his strong personality immediately attracted many young men to the society, and he became very influential at the royal court. Unfortunately, as the provincial of the Portuguese Jesuits, he allowed certain spiritual devotions to develop into extreme ascetical practices and thus caused public scandal, nighttime public calls to penance with self-flagellation in the streets of Coimbra. Several letters of Ignatius calling to restraint and obedience fell on deaf ears. The province was in 2 minds, as many Jesuits admired and respected him, but complaints were made and Rodrigues was recalled. Dragging his feet, he finally reached Rome, where at his own request he was tried in 1544. His 3 Jesuit judges found him guilty of excesses and lack of obedience. All penances were lifted by Ignatius except that he was not allowed to return to Portugal. He was assigned to other duties in Italy and later Spain. Rodrigues was recalcitrant and for several years sought to overthrow the decision against him, but his appeals to friends he had made in high places were unsuccessful. Eventually he gave up these attempts and returned to obedience. As an old man, he was allowed to go back to his native country where, before dying, he wrote a history of the early years of the society. Let's look now at education. During the 1530s, Ignatius of Loyola gathered up a small band of fellow students, and you can see this is from the Jesuits' own site. The small band of students at the University of Paris, they called themselves Amigos en el Señor, friends in the Lord. The companions took vows of poverty and pledged to stay together and keep serving Christ in the world after earning their degrees. A little over a decade later, the first Jesuit school opened in Messina, Sicily in 1548. Today, 3,730 schools carry on this tradition all around the world, caring for 2.5 million students in places ranging from Egypt and Kenya to Nepal and Belize. In Canada and the United States, there are 30 Jesuit colleges and 91 pre-secondary and secondary schools with a shared goal of developing competent, compassionate, and committed leaders in the service of the church and society. One distinctive aspect of Jesuit education at all levels is the emphasis on teaching the whole person, mind, body, and spirit. The schools foster not only intellectual development, but also moral and spiritual growth. At the high schools, the aim is to produce students who are open to growth, intellectually competent, religious, loving, and committed to doing justice by the time they leave. Those are 5 characteristics pinpointed by the periodically updated profile of the graduate of a Jesuit high school at graduation, better known as the Grad at Grad Report. I've just let the Jesuits speak for themselves. As you can see or hear, the Jesuits, while still Catholic, are not concerned as much about counter-Reformation issues now in the 21st century. Georgetown University and Boston College are Jesuit schools. 2 of the best-known 20th century Jesuit thinkers were Pierre Teilhard de Chardin and Karl Rahner. And now I look at the Inquisition and I give you the website information. The eruption of the Protestant Reformation in the first decades of the 16th century brought forth a Roman Catholic response, the Counter-Reformation, a determined campaign to strengthen the Roman Catholic Church and restore religious unity to Europe. One of Rome's key instruments to purify doctrine and root out heresy was the Inquisition. The Counter-Reformation soon reached Portugal, and the Pope III was granted permission to establish the Court of Inquisition in 1536. The court did not begin its work until 1539, when the first Inquisitor General was replaced by a religious zealot, an archbishop who stood for public confession and immediate execution. As elsewhere, the Inquisition in Portugal dealt with all forms of heresy, corruption, and disbelief. But its main victims were the so-called New Christians, Jews who had converted to Christianity after Manuel I had ordered in 1497 the expulsion from Portugal of all Jews who refused to accept the Christian faith. Many Portuguese believed that the New Christians secretly practiced Judaism at home, and the Inquisition was used to stop such an abomination. Courts of the Inquisition functioned in larger settlements around Portugal. The first public burning of a heretic took place in 1540 in Lisbon. In the next 150 years, an estimated 1,400 people perished in this tragic manner. I use the word tragic in Portugal. Next comes the Council of Trent, and here we learn from Britannica.com. Early calls for reform grew out of criticism of the worldly attitudes and policy of the Renaissance popes and many of the clergy, but there was little significant papal reaction to the Protestants or to demands for reform from within the Roman Catholic Church before mid-century. Pope Paul III reigned from 1534 to 49, is considered to be the first pope of the Counter-Reformation. It was he who in 1549 convened the Council of Trent, which is hailed as the most important single event in the Counter-Reformation. The council, which met intermittently until 1563, responded emphatically to the issues at hand and enacted the formal Roman Catholic reply to the doctrinal challenges of the Protestant Reformation. It thus represents the official adjudication of many questions about which there had been continuing ambiguity throughout early church throughout the early church in the Middle Ages. What emerged from the Council of Trent was a chastened but consolidated church and papacy, the Roman Catholicism of modern history. Its doctrinal teaching was a reaction against the Lutheran emphasis on the role of faith and God's grace, and against Protestant teaching on the number and nature of the sacraments. The either-or doctrines of the Protestant reformers, justification by faith alone, the authority of Scripture alone, were anathematized in the name of a both-and doctrine of justification by faith and works, on the basis of the authority of both Scripture and tradition. The privileged standing of the Latin Vulgate was reaffirmed against Protestants' insistence upon the original Hebrew and Greek texts of Scripture. No less important for the development of Roman Catholicism, modern Roman Catholicism, was the legislation aimed at reforming and reforming the internal life and discipline of the Church. Discipline and reforms attacked the corruption of the clergy and affirmed the traditional practice in question of clerical marriage. The council condemned such abuses as pluralism. There was an attempt to take on the training of candidates for the priesthood. Indeed, two of its most far-reaching provisions were the requirement that every diocese provide for the proper education of its future clergy and seminaries under church auspices, and the requirement that the clergy, and especially the bishops, give attention to the task of preaching. Measures were taken against luxurious living on the part of the clergy, and the financial abuses that had been so flagrant in the church at all levels were brought under control. Strict rules requiring the residency of bishops in their dioceses were established, and the appointment of relatives to church office was forbidden. Prescriptions were given about care and the administration of the sacraments, and in place of the liturgical chaos that had been happening, the council laid down specific prescriptions about the form of the Mass and liturgical music. Earlier councils, the Council of Trent, did not result in the diminution of papal authority. Here's a look at some other groups and individuals from Britannica.com. St. Teresa of Avila's beliefs centered on prayerful meditation and poverty for her sisters. Outside of the council, there were various theologians, especially the Jesuit St. Robert Bellarmine, who attacked the doctrinal positions of the Protestant reformers. But there was no one to rival the theological and moral engagement evident in the writings of Martin Luther, or the eloquence and passion characteristic of the works of John Calvin. New religious orders and other groups were founded to effect a religious renewal. For example, the Theatines, the Capuchins, the Ursulines, and especially the Jesuits. Later in the century, St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila promoted the reform of the Carmelite order and influenced the development of the mystical tradition. St. Francis de Sales had a similar influence on the devotional life of the laity. The popes of the Counter-Reformation were largely men of sincere conviction and initiative who skillfully employed diplomacy, persuasion, and force against heresy. During this period of reform and reaction, Roman Catholic theologians and leaders tended to emphasize the beliefs and devotional subjects that were under direct attack by the Protestants. For example, the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, the Virgin Mary, and St. Peter. Let's look now at the phrase Counter-Reformation. Here's what Wikipedia says. Counter-Reformation is a translation of the German Gegenreformation, literally against the Reformation. Protestant historians have tended to speak in terms of Catholic reform as part of the Counter-Reformation itself, or response to the Reformation. In 19th century Germany, the term became part of the German Kulturkampf, or culture war. It was used by Protestant historians as a negative and one-dimensional concept that stressed the aspect of reaction and resistance to Protestantism and neglected that of reform within Catholicism. The term was understandably shunned by Catholic historians. Even when the Protestant historian Wilhelm Mahrenbrecher introduced the term Catholic Reformation in 1880, German historiography remained confessionally divided on the subject. The term Catholic Reformation appealed to Catholic historians because it offered them the possibility of avoiding the term Counter-Reformation with its problematic connotation of a mere reaction to Protestantism. But it was rejected by Protestant historians largely because they did not want the term Reformation to be used for anything other than the Protestant Reformation. And Catholic historians tend to emphasize them as different. The French historian Henri Daniel Rops wrote, "The term Counter-Reformation, however, though common, is misleading. It cannot rightly be applied logically or chronologically to that sudden awakening as of a startled giant, that wonderful effort of rejuvenation and reorganization which in a space of 30 years gave to the Church an altogether new appearance. The so-called Counter-Reformation did not begin with the Council of Trent, long after Luther. Its origins and initial achievements were much anterior to the fame of Wittenberg. It was undertaken not by way of answering the reformers, but in obedience to demands and principles that are part of the unalterable tradition of the Church and proceed from her most fundamental loyalties." The Italian historian Massimo Firpo has distinguished Catholic Reformation from Counter-Reformation by their issues. In his view, the general Catholic Reformation was centered on the care of souls, episcopal residence, the renewal of clergy, together with the charitable and educational roles of the new religious orders, whereas the specific Counter-Reformation was founded upon the defense of orthodoxy, the repression of dissent, the reassertion of ecclesiastical authority. I encourage you to read the entire PDF, but I go now to the end of my lecture and want to share with you both a conclusion and a final story. To every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. The bondage of a 1,000-year-old Bible and the bondage of a bureaucratic corruption in the Roman Catholic Church led to a strong reaction that came to be known as the Protestant Reformation. This caused yet another counteraction-reaction that conveniently came to be called the Counter-Reformation. In a sense, therefore, it could be said that the Protestant Reformation forced the Catholics to make reforms. It also led to rigidity and persecution in the form of the Inquisition and elsewhere. However, some education and other positive things came out of the Counter-Reformation as well. Water would work on rock for decades, generations, and centuries until Vatican II led to a softening and opening by the Roman Catholic Church to Protestant churches and other religions. The Catholic Church remained the Catholic Church with its rich yet challenged history. Popes since then have sometimes upheld the historic Christian faith, some not so much. But with the knowledge of the context of the Counter-Reformation, we can have a better understanding of the Roman Catholic Church, past and present. And here's a final story. Mel Robeck was one of my PhD professors. He was also a member of the Vatican's, that is, Catholic Pentecostal Dialogue. One time Mel was in a greeting line to meet the Pope. When John Paul II came to Mel, John Paul II was told that he was Assemblies of God and he was a Pentecostal. And JP2 reached out his hand and said, you are a Pentecostal. And Mel smiled and nodded his hand and made to end the handshake. But the Pope reached out and kept holding on for the handshake and said, the church draws its strength from Pentecost. And again, Mel made to smile and end the handshake. And the Pope kept holding on and he said, and it still does. The Pope recognized the importance of the original Pentecost and for there to be Pentecostals to this day. Centuries beyond the Counter-Reformation, there was room for growth and common ground. May you find that in your own life and relationships. Amen.